And now along comes a state which gives concrete institutional form to that allegation. Namely, there's a state which says, indeed, Jews do have a primary loyalty to the state of Israel, a loyalty which supersedes their loyalty to their own nation state. And for this reason, American Jews who are now beginning to make it in the United States, they distance themselves from Israel, fearful of this dual loyalty charge. It's a fairly well-documented phenomenon. I'll just cite to you, there are, as I say, older people in the room who will surely remember who was probably the greatest Jewish sociologist and probably the leading sociologist in the United States in the 1950s, a fellow named Nathan Glazer. How many people remember the name? I'm just curious. Good. So in 1957, Nathan Glazer writes a study of American Jewry. It's called American Judaism. And he writes as follows: Israel has had remarkably slight effects on the inner life of American Jewry. It might be added, he also pointed out that the Nazi Holocaust also had very slight effects on American Jewry in this era. Or you can take the case of Elie Wiesel. As late as 1967, he was asked by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, how do you think we can reach American Jews and American Jewry, which seems to be assimilating so much? And Elie Wiesel's reply, this is 1967, April 67, he says, the Jewishness of Jewish youth can still be reached, but not through Israel. Perhaps through the problems of Jews in Russia, perhaps through questions about the Holocaust, but not through Israel. It was a given that you can never reach American Jewry on the question of Israel for the reasons which I just stated, because it raised the bogey of dual loyalty. Well, something dramatic happens, a dramatic change occurs in June 1967. After Israel inflicts a crushing defeat on Arab nationalism, the defeat inflicted on Nasser in Egypt, Israel becomes a strategic asset of the United States. That was the terminology that was, and to a large extent still is used. It becomes a strategic asset for the United States. And now Israel becomes safe, or embracing Israel becomes safe, because now Israel is serving American interests in the Middle East. And so American Jewry now rallies behind Israel, not only because it's safe, but to be pro-Israel now, after June 67, it no longer connotes dual loyalty, the problem in the past. It now connotes super loyalty. Why super loyalty? Because Israel is now on the front lines, defending American interests, defending Western civilization against the Soviets and the Arabs in the Middle East. And so it became a cause to celebrate, not only because it was protecting U.S. interests, but because it was winning. This was 1967, the time of the debacle in Vietnam. While our American soldiers are being defeated in Vietnam, the Israeli, the Defense Forces, the IDF, is inflicting massive defeats on the Arab world. And so now Israel becomes a cause to celebrate and to be proud of, because it's serving U.S. interests and also winning in its cause. And so now, after June 67, obviously it's a very different scene, the scene which I suspect most of you in the room remember, when Israel becomes a main cause of American Jewry. It has to, however, be borne in mind that the Israel which American Jews now supported projected a very liberal image. It was the image of what was back then called socialist Zionism. It was the image of the kibbutzim. It was the image of, accurately, a quite egalitarian society which had very progressive social experiments and which was, even as it acquired territories outside its borders, it was said that it was maintaining a liberal occupation. Israel was then said to be, or seen to be, the light unto the nations. Well, now 2 decades, or in fact 4 decades down the line, things have obviously changed radically. Whereas in its initial decades of its occupation, Israeli policy appeared to many defensible on basic ethical principles. Indeed, the Israeli occupation was said to embody these principles. Now, such a defense is no longer tenable. The era of the beautiful Israel has passed, and the new Israel has become almost or nearly indefensible for American Jewry. And it's become indefensible for a fairly obvious reason. American Jews are overwhelmingly liberal in their political allegiances, in their political and moral convictions. In the last election, 78% of American Jews voted for Barack Obama. Apart from African Americans, no other ethnic group even approached them. Any privileged ethnic group in the United States, actually more Jews voted for Barack Obama than even Latinos voted. I think Latinos, it was 75%. Jews, it was 78%. But then if you start looking in terms of socioeconomic background, Jews were just way out in their liberal allegiances to Barack Obama and to liberal ideas generally. And liberalism in the United States has come to represent some basic principles, namely principles of the rule of law, support for international organizations, support for human rights, equality before the law, so on and so forth. And on all of those basic liberal tenets, it's now become nearly impossible to defend Israeli policy. It's part of an overall trend in American life. The polls, which time doesn't allow me to go through, the poll data is quite revealing. As I said, I can't look at that right now, but I'll just give one, I think, illustrative example. It's the example of what one might call the Jimmy Carter phenomenon. Jimmy Carter pretty much represents the liberal end of the mainstream political spectrum in the United States. He comes out about 2 years ago now, or 1.5 years ago, with a book, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. And when the book comes out, Israel's diehard supporters launch a quite vicious attack trying to discredit him. He was originally called a plagiarist. He was then called in the pay of Arab sheikhs. He was then said to be a borderline Holocaust denier by Deborah Lipstadt of Emory University. Then Neil Scher said that he was a supporter of Nazis, and then it was said he was a supporter of terrorism. Every conceivable and, in fact, conventional epithet and slur and slander was hurled at him. And nonetheless, and despite all that, Jimmy Carter's book ends up selling approximately 300,000 copies in hardback. It's number 1 in the New York Times bestseller list for a sustained period of time. It was quite clear that the usual slurs, slanders, and epithets, they're just not sticking anymore. They're not working. And the reason they're not working is because criticism of Israel has broken into the mainstream, and it's no longer possible to cover over. It's no longer possible to pretend what's going on there is not going on.